Vikings. The mere word conjures up images of barbaric sword-wielding men fiercely ravaging whatever lies in their path. In Scandinavian and North European history, the period in which they lived is referred to as the Viking Age. It lasted for almost 300 years, beginning late in the 8th century and continuing until the year 1066. At first, the Vikings worshipped pagan gods, firm in the belief that a fall in battle would offer them a clear path to a desirable afterlife in Valhalla. But just as the first millennium was nearing its end and Christianity started to spread amongst their kind, yearnings for such violent deaths slowly ebbed away. However, memories of these ferocious Viking men captured in the Icelandic sagas pale in comparison to less frequently told stories about the equally courageous Viking women. One of these intriguing Viking women was Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir from Iceland. Known through the ages as the Far-Traveler, she was the most adventurous explorer of the Middle Ages. The only woman in the world whose expeditions took her both to mainland Europe and to the coastal lands of North America. On 8 separate occasions, Gudrid sailed across the Atlantic Ocean, beating Christopher Columbus to the New World by almost 500 years.
We don't want to take too much credit because there have been many other female spacewalkers before us. This is just the first time that there have been 2 women outside at the same time. And we do, of course, want to give credit to all of those that came before us. There's been a long line of female scientists, explorers, engineers, and astronauts. And we have followed in their footsteps to get us where we are today.
Gudrid should be known as a great explorer. Equal to the Viking explorers, the men explorers that we all know the names of, Erik the Red and Leif Eiriksson.
When you read the sagas, they are about her. They trace her history much more, and she's the one that the people who wrote those stories really cared about. They cared about her history, her life, what she was about, what she did. And it's also clear that Gudrid is the person who is really the woman who was traveled, who had seen the world, and that was important to who she was as a sort of legacy of history.
The Icelandic sagas present a vivid account of the Far-Traveler's life and the epic journeys she undertook across the entire span of her existence. They speak of treacherous ocean voyages to Greenland, of unprecedented meetings with the native peoples of North America, where Gudrid gave birth to a son, and triumphant returns to Europe on her sturdy Viking ship. They also contain a memory of one final pilgrimage to Rome towards the end of her life. Modern discoveries of Viking Age settlement sites in Newfoundland and Iceland shed a new light on these medieval accounts. This is the astonishing story of Gudrid, who rose from humble beginnings to become one of history's most courageous explorers. Gudrid was born in Iceland at the height of the Viking Age, just before the year 1000. Astonishingly, memories and narratives that offer rare glimpses of this distant Viking world were preserved in the Icelandic sagas. These were written on calfskin in the 12th and 13th centuries. Dr. Gisli Sigurdsson is one of the world's most esteemed experts on the sagas.
The sagas of Iceland are unique in the context of medieval literature in the sense that they tell of the fate of ordinary people, not just the high class of society, coming together with a different cultural background, Norse paganism and Gaelic Christianity, trying to build a new peaceful society in a new virgin territory. And they are written by people of that culture in their own language, in a literary style that is much more modern and like the modern realistic novel than it is like current medieval chivalric literature of the time.
Gudrid appears in two of the old sagas, the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eirik the Red. Known together as the Vinland sagas, they were named after the vast land of vine and grapes Gudrid and her travelling companions came upon during their travels in the New World. Although these two sagas were written by different hands, the key turning points in her adventurous life seem to largely correspond.
The saga that tells us most about Gudrid is called officially Eirik the Red saga. But when we read it now with our literary glasses, we see that it's not constructed at all about Eirik the Red, around Eirik the Red's character or life, but it's constructed around the life of Gudrid. So if we were to name the saga now, we would certainly call it the saga of Gudrid. She was the most attractive of women and one to be reckoned with in all her dealings. So that's where her story starts.
903.78.
903, okay. And what's our north thing? I'm trying to get to 196 about.
209.67.
We're still that far north?
Yeah.
209, okay. So.
For more than a decade, a small group of North American and Icelandic scientists have been collaborating on a survey of the entire Skaga Fjord, located in North Iceland, the very same fjord that saw Gudrid live out her final years. The scientists studied settlement patterns by taking soil core samples and digging test trenches, as well as making complete excavations of two cemeteries that have been dated back to the 11th century.
We are looking for the center of the 11th century longhouse or skáli in the field here in Glömbær, just east of the old farmhouse. This is the longhouse from the time that Gudrid would have lived here, from the beginning of the 11th century. According to the excavations and geophysics, it's over 40 meters long and 6 meters wide, which is a fairly big building.
Following their initial fieldwork at the old farmstead of Glömbær, which included test trench digging and extensive use of geophysics, the scientists made an amazing discovery.
It was unexpected to find completely unknown buried Viking Age structures just in fields. You know, most of the Viking Age structures are visible. Like if you want to find a farm, it's there, it's a set of ruins. But here, there's so much soil that accumulates down in the lowlands, it can really erase them. There's nothing to see. It's just field. But one of the main things is that this is where the story says that she and her family come back to when they return to Iceland after living in the New World. And they say that they bought land at Glömbær, which is where we are. And this house down here in the field is the one that was current with that time period and appears to have been rebuilt in the early 11th century, just about the time they would have moved back. So this is as good a place as any for her to be.
We were doing this in almost absence of the sagas. In fact, when we discovered this site, somebody, I forget who it was, said, "So you found Gudrid's house?" And I said, "Who?" So I had to go and read that particular saga. I didn't think the Vineland sagas had anything to do with our study of a settlement pattern.
So I think she's sort of come into her own as the main character. And of course, you know.
And she's a fantastically dynamic character. Center of house.
Center of house, excellent.
Should we go find some ends of the house?
Yeah, I think that would be in order.
Okay, so we're 21 meters this way.
The Vikings, or Norse people, as they were often called, seem mostly to be remembered for their forceful conquests. But who were these people, really?
The Vikings were a fierce lot who came from Scandinavia. In around 800, they seem to have developed a new technique of shipbuilding with the keel that enabled them to sail in exceptionally low waters. so they could navigate rivers, come ashore almost anywhere, and make their attack swiftly, get what they wanted, and flee on the next tide. So they had no difficulty or problem with violence. They thought that if they could go and get what they wanted, they would kill whoever was in their way. We also know them as traders, of course, and settlers and artistic craftsmen and so on. So they explored the entire European area that could be accessed from sea and rivers. They served on the guard in Constantinople, and their ultimate defeat was in 1066 when Haraldur Harðráði, King of Norway, fell when he got too ambitious trying to invade England and conquer it in 1066.
Gudrid was born in Iceland, but her ancestry can be traced back to both Ireland and Scotland. Her grandfather, Vífill, was brought as an enslaved nobleman on a Viking ship across the North Atlantic, accompanying the Queen of Dublin, who gave him freedom and land upon arrival in Iceland. Auðr, the deep-minded, serves as an inspiration for another Viking legend recalled in the sagas. This powerful Queen of Dublin fled to Iceland from the Scottish Isles, with her entourage of some 250 people. Dr. Andrew Jennings of the University of Highlands and Islands spends his days teaching the rich and varied history of the Viking Age in Scotland.
Well, here we are at the King's Stone in Denmark Field, and it commemorates the death of a Scandinavian king, according to local tradition. And there was also supposedly a battle fought at Lunkerty, which took place just over on the horizon there. When we go back to the early 8th century, Scotland as we know it today didn't exist. Auðr the deep-minded, or the wise, I suppose we could call her. Auðr married Olafur Hincvíti, which is Olaf the White, who we know as a king of Dublin from the Irish annals, who ruled in the 860s and 870s. She was one of the great figures in Viking society at the time. However, Olafur died, or rather he was killed, and that put Auðr in a rather tricky position. So she and her son, Thorstein the Red, came across to what's now Scotland, and Thorstein went on the rampage in the north of Scotland, conquering large territories. However, he also died, and Auðr was again in a very problematical position. But as a great woman, as a powerful figure, she had a large entourage, a large number of people who were following her. And these included free people and freed men and women, and also thralls.
At this time, Iceland had recently been discovered. Auðr managed to escape wartime violence both in Ireland and Scotland. She needed a new, safe place to settle. She commissioned the construction of a large Viking ship in Scotland. Upon its completion, she captained the ship to Iceland with her large entourage, which included Gudrid's grandfather.
I think Gudrid would have known everything there was to know about Auðr. Auðr was a famous woman. She was a ship's captain. She'd been a queen of Dublin. She'd done extraordinary things, and she'd given Gudrid's grandfather land. So I'm sure she would have known plenty of stories about Auðr, and she would have been inspired, and she would have been trying to match up to this peerless woman of the past.
Gudrid was born here on the tip of Snæfellsnes, probably somewhere in the land claim of Laugarbrekka. This place here is called Laugarbrekka. Her grandfather settled here. Her mother died sometime when she was a child. We don't know exactly the story because that's not in the sagas. So she lived pretty much all through this area.
American author Nancy Marie Brown has written several books relating to the Vikings, 2 of which were inspired by the life and times of Gudrid.
Gudrid, I call her the Far-Traveler. I'm not the first person to give her that name. She was given that by some other scholars earlier in the century because there were some men of her time who were called the Far-Traveler, and they didn't travel nearly as far as she did. She's the first woman to go to North America from Iceland, probably from Europe, and the first mother of European extraction in North America. She lived somewhere in Canada or United States for about 3 years and had a son there named Snorri. And she and her husband and Snorri came back to Iceland and lived here and had many descendants. So she's a very important person in the history of Iceland, but also in the history of North America.
During these early years in Iceland, when Gudrid was still a child, conflicts between neighbouring settlers was common. Taking sides in a dispute was often how a person survived. Gudrid's father, Thorbjorn, son of Vividl, the freed slave, is described as a headstrong man who protects and supports his daughter. When she rejects the advances of her first suitor, also the son of a freed slave, Thorbjorn stands by his daughter. He had few close friends, but notable amongst them was Erik Thorvaldsson, dubiously nicknamed Erik the Red.
Gudrid's father was a good friend of Erik the Red, and in fact one of the few people who supported him when Erik was outlawed.
Erik the Red is presented as a troublemaker in the texts, so there are 2 conflicting origin stories about him, but they are all consistent in always presenting him as getting into some conflict with his neighbors.
But the connection with Erik the Red was very important because Thorbjorn, Gudrid's father, was one of the few important men in the area who actually protected him from his enemies so that he could make his great escape and discover Greenland. So there was a very strong link there. Thorbjorn was willing to put his life on the line for Erik the Red.
Erik the Red is exiled from Iceland after killing his neighbour, and as a result he goes on a voyage to Greenland to explore the possibilities of settlement there, and he spends 3 years exploring this vast land. He returns to Iceland with the news that this newly discovered territory, although covered with glaciers in the middle, has deep fjords which are green and inviting.
The news all around was of this green land where the land was there for the taking, and it was lush and it was beautiful. And of course they didn't really know what it looked like. We hear that according to the sagas, Erik the Red was a great salesman, and he had decided to give it a good name so that people would go there. So it seemed like it might be a good idea for him to go to this new Greenland where his friend Erik had promised him a farm, and to give it a try. Things aren't working out here on the tip of Snæfellsnes. He didn't, mostly because he sided with Erik the Red, he didn't have a lot of friends on the other parts of Iceland who had outlawed Erik. So he didn't really have an opportunity to move to somewhere else in Iceland. And for some reason he didn't remarry, we don't know why, but he decided to give it a chance and go to Greenland. And we think Gudrid was about 15 when they set off.
In those days, making the journey across the sea from Iceland to Greenland was adventurous and daring, even on a fine day. However, Gudrid and her crew were extremely unlucky with the weather. Due to unfavourable winds, they were tossed about at sea all summer. They ran out of food, then fresh water, and many of the people on the ship perished. Even with the aid of today's cutting-edge technology, making the crossing from Iceland to Greenland can be extremely hazardous. captain and Viking shipbuilder Gunnar Marel Eiriksson knows firsthand the dangers of sailing that same route on a Viking ship.
Sko, ég upplifi mig alltaf mjög ábyrgðarfulla á hafinu vegna þess að þetta jú skip frá þessum tíma og maður þarf að skila mannskap og öllu saman heilu þangað sem maður ætlar að fara. Það tók mig töluverðan tíma að átta mig á því að ég gat ekkert haga mér á svona skipi eins og á stálskipi veiðandi fisk út á hafi, sko. Það bara býður hættulega. Ég var búinn að vera á vakt yfir heila nótt og fór að sofa klukkan 6 morgun og sofnaði og dreymdi svartklædda konu. Ég er nú ekki alltaf hræddur við þær, sko. En var alveg hræddur við þessar, sko. Sótti illa á mig og ég glaðvaknaði og fór aftur á til þeirra sem voru á vakt og sagði að jæja, nú komum við. Það var svona leiðindarveður, slydduhraglandi og töluverður ís á svæðinu sem var bara alls ekkert spennandi. Við svona meira og minna börðuðust fyrir að halda skipinu á floti í 10 klukkutíma. Og það einn mesti léttir í mínu lífi þegar ég komast út úr því, sko.
Gudrid and their crew are shipwrecked before they reach Greenland. So they are shipwrecked on some little island off the coast of Greenland, which must have been a perfectly terrible place to be shipwrecked because there is nothing in sight. You can see the big glaciers of Greenland and the icebergs in the water, and you can't get to a shore where you can find anything. So they were pretty much out of luck, having been shipwrecked on this skerry off the coast of Greenland. And here comes Leif the Lucky. And this is how he got his nickname.
Upon his return to the Greenland colony, following his expedition to Vinland, Leif Eiriksson, son of Eric the Red, noticed the shipwreck and took immediate action to rescue Gudrid from the skerry. As a result of this brave deed, he is given the nickname that will carry him into legend, Leif the Lucky. This belief of being blessed with good luck for rescuing people at sea is still alive in Iceland today. Gudrid soon comes to realize that Greenland is not the promised land. Her thoughts turn to the new territories beyond Greenland, which she has heard about from Leif the Lucky, who had previously explored the east coast of North America and named it Hetluland, Markland and Vinland, from Baffin Island and south into the Gulf of St. Lawrence in Atlantic Canada. Gudrid later married Leif's brother, and together they set sail for this new world in the west. As fate would have it, terrible weather blew them far from their course, and soon after their eventual arrival back in Greenland, Gudrid was laying her new husband's body to rest.
One of the other interesting things about the sagas about Gudrid is they have a lot of folklore and superstition and magical happenings in them.
Everything that we would classify as supernatural was natural in this context. There is a seeress or a prophetess that is called upon to come and tell the future because of terrible times that people are having in Greenland. She needs for the magic to work a certain song to be sung, but no one knows the song except for Gudrid, who learned it from her family back home in Iceland. Varðlokur, it even has a name, Varðlokur, and we know from Gaelic Scotland the idea of warlock poems.
Well, Gudrid is Christian. She and her father are both Christian. And she says, well, I don't really know if I should. I'm a Christian woman and this is a pagan ceremony. And so she thinks about it and she talks to the seer, and the seer says, you know, you could still be Christian and do this. You're just helping out some people. And so she thought, well, I can help them out, make them feel better. So she sang the songs.
Ef mér verður þörf mikil hafts við mína heift mögu, ef mér fyrðar bera bönd að bólimum, Steikjar ég deyfi minna andskota, býta þeim hvorki vopn ég vélir, svo ég gel að ég ganga má, sprettur mér af fótum fjötur, en af höndum haft. Þá kann ég rún að rista, þann kann ég galdur að gala, þá kann ég rún að rista, þann kann ég galdur að gala.
And we are told that no one had ever sung them more beautifully, that she had this lovely singing voice. And it's one of the only details we have of what Gudrid herself was like. I mean, she is standardly beautiful, or she is wise or intelligent, but this is the only little personal details, that she had a lovely singing voice. And of course, the spirits, flock around and tell the fortune of various people in the house, including Gudrid herself, who is going to have this magnificent list of descendants that goes down to several bishops, which is how it does turn out, of course. She was living in what they call the Eastern Settlement with Leif Eiriksson after she was widowed. And as a widow, she had more rights than as an unmarried young woman. She could have a say in who she was going to marry next, or even if she was going to marry. She could inherit the property of her dead husband. So she was a very wealthy young woman, no matter which saga you read. And she was probably only 17 or 18 years old at the time anyway. At which point, an Icelandic trader named Thorfinn Karlsefni from Skagafjörður comes to Greenland with 2 ships.
Karlsefni comes along, fine merchant from Iceland of the highest possible birth that that country could provide.
I imagine that they may have caught each other's eye. We don't know, but since Gudrid had the power to say no, and she didn't, we think that she probably liked this young man from Iceland, this Thorfinn Karlsefni.
The 2 of them get together and ultimately get married and start planning on a second Vinland voyage, and with the intent to settle there in a new land.
And yet the saga is very clear that people started talking about putting together another expedition to Vinland, and Gudrid thought it was a good idea and wanted to go. And it's very clear in whichever saga you read that she had a lot to do with the planning of this expedition.
Gudrid was determined to leave the Greenland colony, whose numbers at this time ran only to a few hundred. She wanted to journey again to Vinland, sailing once more through waters that had proved so perilous last time. The sagas reveal that Gudrid, Karlsefni and their entourage made the journey to North America on 3 well-equipped Viking ships. Their route is traced north to Disco Island, where they made the crossing south to Hetlaland and then southeast along Markland until they reached an island that may well have been Belle Isle, just off the northernmost tip of Newfoundland, where Leif's second brother had previously stayed in Leif's camp, a place today known as Lance o' Meadows.
Lance Meadows is the only authenticated site, Norse site in North America at this point. And we know from the size of Lance o' Meadows that there were as many as 70 to 90 people there.
Dr. Birgitta Wallace is a key archaeologist of Viking history in North America. She was part of the original team that made the discovery of Norse artifacts at Lance Meadows in the early 1960s and took part in the first excavation.
Lance Meadows is in a very unprotected area, very non-typical, very close to the sea for one thing, and it's in a very windy spot. From what we can tell of the radiocarbon dates, we trust they were there around the year 1000 on either side. The closest we can come is about 20 years on either side.
Í uppgretturinu 1964 að þá fundu þeir mikla hauga af saum úr skipum, hnossum, þessum hérna. Og það segir okkur, og allt það sem fannst í þessum uppgretti segir þá sögu að þarna hafi verið mikið umleikis með skip að gera. Viðhald á skipum hafi átt sér stað þarna mjög mikið. Að áður en fóru yfir hafa þá var skipið tekið upp og gegnum farið allt saman frá A til Ö.
Evidence of iron production and woodwork were found in the so-called Norse lairs at Lance Meadows, supporting the idea that the Vikings repaired their ships in this area. Such evidence corresponds neatly with the same time period referred to in the sagas. The buildings and artifacts found at Lance Meadows seem to suggest that the location was a hub for the Viking voyages to the New World. The excavations revealed several wood-framed turf buildings, constructed in exactly the same style and time period as those found in Norse Greenland and Iceland. In total, 3 long houses were discovered, in addition to a number of smaller huts. Dr. Wallace remembers the day clearly when the excavation team found the most interesting artifact, a distinctively Norse spindle whorl used for spinning wool.
And I looked at it, and it was a typical Viking Age spindle whorl. So for me, that was a great experience. I mean, people always ask us, especially on large excavations, are you finding gold? Wouldn't it be exciting to find gold or something? And so, but a spindle whorl like that is much more interesting than that because it tells us something. And it tells us that the Norse were there, and it's a typical Viking Age period. And also, the people who were spinning were the women. So we knew women had been there. We later learned that most of the artifacts certainly had been created by men and were attached to men. But there were women there too, and that we knew the moment we saw it. And that gives some meaning to an artifact. That's what we are after. And the archaeology confirmed, really, the people who came were men, with just a few women.
So the fact that a spindle whorl was found at Lance Meadows means that very likely a woman was there, and there's no reason not to believe that it was Gudrid herself. So we have these connections between the sagas and the archaeology, which are quite fascinating.
Another revealing artifact, butternuts of the walnut tree were discovered in the Norse lairs at Lance Meadows. Butternuts are not native to Newfoundland. The nearest location where they can be found lies about 600 kilometres southwest of Lance Meadows, on the southern shores of the Gulf of St. Lawrence in Canada.
Butternuts were found in the Norse layers, and that is a big discovery because butternut trees don't grow naturally in Lance Meadows.
This strongly suggests that the Icelanders did indeed voyage further south, just as the sagas remember. Prince Edward Island and New Brunswick were rife with butternut trees and wild grapes. This is why Leif had given the area the name he did, Vinland, land of wine.
And it led me to conclude that Vinland, and especially the good part of Vinland where they could pick wild grapes and butternut. It could have been farther south, but as far as we can see from Lonesome Meadows, they did not come in direct contact with indigenous people right there. But if they went to New Brunswick, they would have come across the biggest native populations in all of Atlantic Canada. And these people were the ancestors of the Mi'kmaq, who had populated these areas in New Brunswick where the butternuts and grapes grow for, we know now, for at least 7,000 years.
The Mi'kmaq is a First Nations people that still inhabit Canada's Atlantic provinces.
The land is about equally densely populated as Western Europe at the time. So if you come with 3 Viking ships and set up camp, you're bound to meet a lot of natives.
Chief Tully Paul is a local chief and elder of the Mi'kmaq people, living close to the Miramichi River in New Brunswick.
Our people were very close to nature, close to the river. The river was their stronghold, and we survived from season to season, where we fished and gathered and hunt. Our people were very spiritual connected, and they had a lot of visions, and they would see these people coming, and they would warn the other people, but they would know they were on their way. Yeah, they must have seen the ship. They thought it was a big bird or some kind of a big winged bird, and because they could see the sails, but they didn't know that was a ship. They thought they were very strange-looking creatures.
There are several memories in the sagas of the big salmon, deer, self-sown wheat, wild grapes, plenty of flounder, burrs and whales, as well as encounters with the Native Americans. In those early days, the Icelanders traded with the natives, who were curious and friendly towards these pale-skinned people who'd arrived from far away.
Tala við sín.
Ég heiti Guðríður. Hvert þitt heiti?
Ég heiti Gorish.
Gudrid is meeting a native woman saying, "Ég heiti Gudrid, my name is Gudrid," and the native woman repeats back with exactly the same words, and this has caused some philological difficulties because people were looking at this in the manuscript and this is a mistake. The scribe has made an error here, but once folklorists come and read this story, this is exactly the kind of joke that came up when Europeans were exploring the world 500 years later and meeting all kinds of native peoples, and people had no idea about the other language. And this is what would happen. People would be repeating phrases. The sagas more or less I think showing us that this is a genuine memory of the confrontation with a totally different language that didn't understand a single word. Because in the European context, the Vikings were moving between different languages, but they always had an interpreter. And so once they get to North America, there is no one to help them.
Gudrid and her husband, Karlsefni, along with their crew, spent 3 years in the New World exploring this fertile land. They went south beyond Leif's Vinland to a streamy fjord with an island at its mouth where they set up their camp. During that time, Gudrid gave birth to a son, whom she and her husband named Snorri, the first child of European descent ever born in North America. Friendly exchanges of goods such as woven cloth and animal skins often took place. The Native Americans also became interested in their visitors' iron weapons, but Gudrid's husband banned all weapons trading between the two groups. The Icelanders, however, did offer the Native Americans milk, a much valued commodity amongst their kind, but the friendly trading turned sour when the milk didn't quite agree with the lactose-intolerant natives.
And when they were offered that milk, they thought it was a good gesture on their part and to make maybe peace and friendship. And when they drank that milk and they got sick from it and they got angry and maybe they thought they were being poisoned and then took action and said, we're gonna let you know that that wasn't acceptable.
And just at this time, there's a great noise outside. One of the Vikings has killed one of the Indians. They had been, trying to trade. They'd been trying to, make some kind of arrangement. And the Indian reaches for the Viking's sword, like touching it. What is this thing? Can I have one too? And the Viking kills him. And of course, the Indians then run away. The woman runs away. The Vikings are going, okay, now what do we do? And the next time the Native Americans come, they come as warriors. They don't come to trade or to see who are these strange people in the boats.
Because our warriors back then, they were very fierce warriors. They were very powerful warriors. They were very tall. They were very strong. And when something like that happens, they really can do a lot of damage.
The Vikings are vastly outnumbered, and so they manage to escape from this battle, but it's clear that they can't stay.
Before their eventual departure from the New World, Gudrid's expedition ventured still further south, where they passed a flat, prominent peninsula covered with deer, which reminds us of Cape Cod, a hook-shaped peninsula that protrudes from today's Massachusetts in the United States. But why didn't the Vikings continue their explorations? What stopped them from settling in this lush new world?
As the stories remember this, first it's a very risky business. They go with 3 ships, only 1 returns. So from the perspective of the investor who is going to take the risk of exploring these lands beyond, this is the chances that you're faced with. You lose 2 out of 3, and no one is willing to risk their money with that. But they also have a memory of the encounters with the native population, that even though they are friendly at first, they finally clash and they fight, and they more or less have to run for their lives, the Norsemen, because they are of course outnumbered by the native population.
Unlike the Europeans who came in the 16th century, they didn't bring any disease. They didn't change indigenous culture anywhere or their lifestyle. They came and looked and left.
After Gudrid, her husband, and their young son Snorri decided to leave the New World, they made their way back across the Atlantic to Norway. Once there, they sold off the exotic goods they'd acquired in North America and made themselves a fortune. Eventually, this far-travelled family concluded their epic journey together with one more voyage back to Iceland. This was Gudrid's 6th crossing of the Atlantic Ocean. However, there was still more to come. Gudrid and her family decided to settle near her husband's homestead in Skagafjord in the north of the country. Her mother-in-law was at first shocked by the low social status of her son's wife that he'd met in Greenland, until she realised the strength of Gudrid's character. It is said that Gudrid and Karlsefni set up their own homestead in Glombyr. The extra space was certainly needed, for by this time they had been joined by another son, Thorbjorn. Following the death of her husband, Gudrid, now in the twilight of her life, invested more time in her growing faith and the dutiful worship of her Christian God. But her deep longing for what she was in years gone by, that far traveller, had not left her.
They had in Skagafjord, there are 2 farms at least. They had Reniness and they had Glombyr. And apparently she got along with her son Snorri very well, because she decided after he married, she gave him instructions to build a church on the farm at Glombyr, and she decided to go to Rome to visit the Pope and to become a nun.
I think one of her most important travel was her walk down to Rome. Because she didn't do that with her husband, or there was no guy that took her there. Yeah. She walked down to Rome.
Yeah.
And that is really important with the whole idea of early Christianity. She became an anchoress and sort of solitary worshipper in a way. And that is I think that is a really important reference to how early Christianity might have been represented.
Travelling from Iceland in northern Europe all the way to Rome in Italy in the 11th century was no small feat. The journey could have taken at least 3 months each way. The sagas don't recount how Gudrid did that or which route she took. Some scholars have suggested she might have first sailed to Scandinavia, then made her way south to Rome on known pilgrim routes throughout Europe.
Yeah, if we imagine the possible routes that Gudrid could have taken to go to Rome, she might have gone across to Norway and down that way, but Norway wasn't particularly Christian at that point. However, she might have wanted to come across to the Hebrides, where her grandfather Vífill had been. We know that the Hebrideans were Christian. She could have gone down via the Irish Sea towards Dublin. The Vikings who'd settled in Dublin had long been Christian as well. And from there, she could have made it across England to France and then to Rome. And that's the way I would like to imagine her traveling.
The story says that she also made it back, which would have been, quite an amazing journey, walking most of the way. And she lived her last years at Glumbyr as a nun, whatever that meant. But it meant that she was an independent woman, that she could make decisions about how her farm was to be run. The farm was to be given to the church after her lifetime, but that apparently was fine with everyone in the family. And she lived out her life there. And we don't know how long she lived, so she might have lived a long time, or she might have died soon after she came back from Rome. But that story has been preserved in the sagas and by her descendants for hundreds of years before it was written down. So it probably has some truth to it.
During their excavations of a cemetery near Gudrid's homestead in Skagafjord, the team unearthed several skeletons from the 11th century. Men and women that would have been contemporaries of Gudrid's, people she might even have called friends.
Það náttúrulega þegar maður að grafa upp leifar mannesku að þá fer maður svolítið að hugsa um hennar líf og hvað gæti mögulega að hafa á hennar daga drifið. Og þessi herramaður hérna að hann gæti allt eins hafa verið á skipinu sem Gudrid fór á til Vínlands og komið tilbaka. Hver veit?
Scots, particularly those living in Orkney and Shetland, I think are proud of their Norse heritage. The Vikings had a big impact on Scotland, particularly in the Middle Ages. They've left their place names in the Hebrides and in Orkney and Shetland. They've contributed to our gene pool. And if you go to Shetland, you'll discover that the Scandinavian language there only died out around 1800.
And when you start piecing together what she did, she ends up being an extremely attractive and adventurous and strong woman. Probably, I would say, one of the best examples of a saga woman, because she just does so many things that are so difficult to imagine that a woman could do, and she pulls it off so easily. She does, she crosses the North Atlantic 8 times, and few people did that even once.
You would hardly be able to achieve that on a sailing ship and on foot in the modern world. It would be exceptionally costly, and it would require a lot of determination that I don't see in any individual of today.
Gudrid's voyages in the 11th century might well be likened to today's astronauts. Brave souls who aren't averse to danger, but will face it head-on if it will advance the course of man and womankind. Perhaps someday, new sagas will be written about such people, and their names too will pass into legend. Today, every person of Icelandic ancestry can trace their roots back through almost 30 generations to Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir. For a woman born to the most humble of families, whose grandfather was a slave, who survived a terrible shipwreck and lost her husbands, who fought off grief and travelled unscathed through a maze of unknown territories, who gave birth to the first ever transatlantic child, who knew the world as a wild and unknown frontier, but navigated a safe path through it, her life, the most far-travelled of the Viking age, truly is a remarkable one.